Welcome. Welcome. We are so happy to have you here. My name is Carol Crawford, and I am a member of the Social Science Curriculum Committee, and we're glad to have you today for this session. Please take out your cell phones. Ensure they are silenced so as not to distract from today's presentation. Thank you. Also, welcome to the crowd joining via Zoom in the HASP virtual classroom. And special thanks to our course technician, Amanda Root. Thank you for supporting our hybrid modality. So we have a wonderful presenter today, Roger Durham, MA, PhD from the University of Oregon.
Let's go Ducks.
He's a Palmatier Endowed Professor in Political Science and Director of the International Studies Program at Aquinas College. His areas of research include international humanitarian law with a focus on responsibility to protect, counter-terror politics in the broader context of American foreign policy, and just war theory. In comparative politics, he researches authoritarian and neo-fascism and neo-nationalism and the impact on democracy. In the area of American politics, he researches anti-democratic extremist movements and political cult-like behavior. And this is an abbreviated list. Please welcome Roger Durham.
Well, thank you, Carol. It's a pleasure to be here. At a small place like Aquinas, we have to do a little bit of everything. That's obvious. So this semester, I'm teaching a course on Latin American politics, and next semester, I'll change hats and teach a course on Middle East politics. But before we go any further, I want to make a good shout out to Ian McNeil. Ian is a graduate of Aquinas College and was our outstanding senior in international, or rather in political science his senior year, with a double major in mathematics. So Ian's the real deal. You're lucky to have Ian over here at HASP. Oh, yes. And the way we're going to handle questions is we're going to watch the video first. And then if you have a question, just raise your hand and I'll repeat the question so that the people online can hear it. I'd rather have a discussion than a lecture. We'll have a much better time if we do that. So I want to start by just saying this video overall is quite good. I would argue that it needs a little specificity and some definition. So one of the things I thought we'd do after we watch the video is talk about what is democracy and what is authoritarianism, because the speaker kind of throws those out without any real operationalization of those. So with that, I think we'll begin. The same, I just introduced you, Ian, and give a thumbs up. So there, make sure you give Ian kudos. Do I just hit play? Oh, next. That'll work.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to Great Decisions. We begin the second half of this 8-lecture masterclass by turning our attention to politics in Latin America, with a particular focus on democracy development and recent elections. There are 3 main considerations that we will take before considering U.S. foreign policies towards the region. We'll look at Latin America before the emergence of democracy. We'll consider Latin American political tides, and then finally we'll take a look at contemporary elections. Globally speaking, democracy has risen in a series of waves. The first wave happened shortly after World War I with a sharp uptick in the number of democracies. There was a second wave after the Second World War, and then finally a third wave occurred in the aftermath of the Cold War. The trend in waves of democracy looks something like this. A major event occurs. It could be something profoundly bad, like a world war, or something quite good, such as the peaceful end of the Cold War that leads to a rise in democracy, a democratic wave. Then there is a crest, followed by decline. As we look at the world democratically speaking and categorizing countries by the degree of democracy, we do note a couple of troubling trends in our hemisphere. Mexico has been downgraded lately from a flawed democracy to a hybrid regime, and the United States has suffered 5 consecutive downgrades in its democratic status. Once a full democracy, according to The Economist, the United States is now a flawed democracy. Looking more specifically at Latin America and where it stands in these global waves of democracy, it was in the late 1980s and through the early part of the 21st century that most of the countries of Latin America and the Caribbean transitioned from authoritarianism to a democracy. If we were to create a hierarchy of democracies south of the border, without doubt, Costa Rica and Uruguay are at the top, impressive in their democratic systems. At the bottom, we have countries like Cuba and Haiti, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, clearly non-democracies. And then most of the other countries in the region, including Mexico, are either flawed or hybrid democracies. We begin by looking at Latin America pre-democracy, and that, of course, is the era of colonization. The Europeans arrived, most notably the Iberians, Spain and Portugal, and came to dominate most of the region in search of cheap labor and also exportable resources. When the Napoleonic campaigns began in early 19th century Europe, the countries that dominated Latin America were gravely weakened. They prioritized the war in Europe over their colonial possessions in our hemisphere. And as a result of that, many of the countries of South America became independent nations in the 1820s. While becoming independent from Europe, the Latin American countries were not able to secure their independence from the other major power, the United States, which had clear aims and intentions towards the region. In 1823, the United States announced the Monroe Doctrine, stating that this region should be free and clear of European influence. By 1904, the Roosevelt Corollary regarded the region as one where the U.S. had the right to intervene militarily as necessary to preserve our interests. So what is it about American interventions? Nicaragua alone was invaded 9 times by the United States in the 1900s. Other countries also were targeted. One of our purposes was to attain great power status. A great power is a particularly large and impressive country that wins most of its military battles and defines its interests continentally, if not globally. It is also a power that is accepted into the great power club by other members of that club. In order to gain entrance, the United States believed it needed to dominate the region of the Western Hemisphere. We break through in 1898 by defeating Spain in the Spanish-American War and attaining great power status. To establish regional dominance was certainly one of the principal aims of U.S. interventions in the region, to secure allies in governments across South America and the Caribbean, and finally to prevent European intrusions moving forward. When we look at Latin America today and ask them basic questions, where is the most influence coming from? Is it the United States? Is it China or some other? The United States is still the one most point to. We are the dominant influence in the region, but look at how quickly China has emerged. It's now number 2 in ranking and closing in on the United States. A few years ago, a great decision was China in Latin America, where we focused exclusively on Chinese investments, loans, and political inroads in Latin America and the Caribbean. We asked Latin American citizens, who do you trust more? And while the United States is still number 1 at 56, look at how close on a scale of 0 to 100 the members of Latin America look at China. They view it as being as trustworthy nearly as the United States. And finally, we ask countries in Latin America, what is your role model? How would you like your country to develop both politically and economically? Again, on a scale of 0 to 100, the United States barely breaks 30 in a single country in the region. That, of course, is our southern neighbor, Mexico. Most other countries have very little faith in the American political and economic model. The transition to democracy in Latin America is thoroughly impressive. If we go back to the late 1970s, there are only a handful of countries, marked here in blue, that we would label as democratic. By 2000, almost every country in the region was viewed as democratic, with Mexico in 2000 joining the club for the first time. The political tides of Latin America have changed over the decades. We've seen a red tide after World War II, followed by a black tide, a pink tide in the 1990s, and now today we see political decay, declining democratic status, and what is referred to as a gray tide, as reflected in national elections. We begin with the red tide. That, of course, represents communism, and the primary advocate of that early on was Fidel Castro of Cuba. Castro led a peasant movement similar to what we saw in China in 1945 under Mao. He rejected the elites that ran the show in Havana, that invited the Western investors and property owners. He sought at the center of his political platform social justice for all Cubans. The red tide that began with Castro did spread to places like Nicaragua, and as it did, we viewed those nations as proxies of the Soviet Union, because the red tide occurred within the context of the Cold War struggle. As a result, we directed ranging military, political, economic, and intelligence pressure on those governments. We saw them as adversaries, and we sought regime change in those countries. The red tide, and America's response to it, resulted in the black tide of Latin America. The black tide of Latin America is associated with brutal and repressive authoritarian regimes, governments that were closely aligned to and supported by the United States, because we prioritized the struggle against communism over desires for democracy and social justice in the region. Having said that, the close alliance to the United States led to economic growth in most of those authoritarian regimes, which allowed them to stay in power for sustained periods of time. Third, we have the pink tide that occurred after the Cold War ended, where Latin America became democratized and immediately turned to the political left. Center-left and far-left candidates were successful in national elections. And because of that, we saw a more progressive and socialist agenda pursued. Many of the leaders of the pink tide, however, became rather rich and authoritarian over time. All power, Lord Acton reminds us, tends to corrupt, but absolute power corrupts absolutely. We saw that happening in the liberal movements in Latin America. Nowhere was it more evident than in Evo Morales in Bolivia. He was a poor cocoa leaf farmer. He was a social engager and activist. He became the president of Bolivia in 2006 and remained there until 2019. And while he advocated for the poor and pursued policies that would promote universal education, land rights, and economic opportunity, he benefited greatly from his position in power. When he stepped down, he had a net worth of $185 million. The people of Latin America see through this. They hear the words that they want to hear, namely social justice and opportunity for all, but they also witness the rapid concentration of wealth in the hands of those at the top. The gray tide is the most recent wave in Latin America, and while it's not the most troubling, clearly the red tide and black tide were more devastating for the region, it does have ominous implications moving forward. Because the gray tide is synonymous with public disenchantment with politics. People are losing faith in the political order and in democracy. They're growing gravely tired of the violence that's happening on their city streets, and they want a firm hand in office that can calm affairs at home and promote the interest of a stable country moving forward. And this means they're moving away from democracy. What we're seeing happening in Latin America with the gray tide is the decline of democracy that is synonymous with other waves of democracy, globally speaking. The four tides of Latin America. The red tide is now gone. The pink tide led to the gray tide, which now seems to be reverting back to something akin to the black tide. Strong authoritarian leaders in place. So what's wrong with Latin America? What is hampering the region's democratic trend line? Low levels of public support in elected officials is first among all others. Then there are the anchors of history that just prevent Latin America from moving forward on the political spectrum. Those anchors include concentrations of power, militaries that are willing to jump in, overthrow democratically elected leaders as necessary, and low public participation in the political system. Income inequality is a major obstacle to democracy. When the vast majority of people don't own land, don't have economic wealth, they feel like the political order does not reflect their interest, therefore they don't want to participate. When they do, they have very little faith in the outcome. And then there is the crime and violence associated with Latin America these days, whether it is the drug lords of Mexico or the incredible violence in countries in Central America, not to mention the disaster that is Venezuela. There's a widespread concern over simple matters of safety. Therefore, many people in Latin America want a stronger government associated with a strong police force and a very capable military to maintain public order. Now we look at contemporary elections in the region. Since most all of Latin America has become democratic of late, there are a lot of elections happening each year. In 2020, we saw elections in these countries, 2021 in those, and in 2022, major elections happening in key countries like Brazil and Colombia. In the near future, 2023, more elections happening in Central and South America. In 2024 and 25, other elections will be happening. So there's a constant turnover of national government in Latin America. But what direction are these elections taking? In the period 20 to 2022, there have been many elections in Latin America. We can chart the results of those elections on a political or ideological spectrum ranging from socialism on the left to the hard right. 3 elections have resulted in centrist candidates, while a full 8 elections in Latin America over this short time period have resulted in leftist governments taking power. Chile, which turned left in its recent election, has made an abrupt U-turn, turning on its new guard. Gabriel Boric, as you see here, a left-winger, was elected in Chile at the age of 36, making him the youngest democratically elected leader in the world. He promised a new constitution, one that would anchor leftist principles, a constitution that was put up to national referendum and shot down by a near 2-to-1 majority of Chileans. They simply did not want the country to go that far left. Here we can see the outcome of many elections in Latin America between 2020 and 2022. The big election occurred more recently, and that, of course, is in Brazil. The face-off was between a current president on the left and a past president on the right, a scenario we may well see happen here in the United States in 2024. The incumbent sitting president is Jair Bolsonaro. He is from the hard right. Many refer to him as the Trump of Brazil, if not the Trump of Latin America. He was elected in 2018 and faced re-election challenge in 2022 by a candidate from the left whose name is Lula da Silva, otherwise known as Lula. Lula is left of center when he campaigns. He moves back to the right when he governs, and then goes back to the left when it's time for re-election. We know this because he was twice elected president of Brazil and reigned from 2003 until 2011. He has an impressive resume of leadership, of economic growth, of global popularity, and also an extended period in prison because he was convicted of corruption shortly after he left office. He was released from jail by a Supreme Court justice, and that allowed him to run in 2022. Before the election occurred, the candidate on the right was already undermining the democracy of Brazil, claiming before the election occurred that fraud was happening, that the only way that he could lose is if the other side cheated, by refusing to concede once the election was over, and even hinting at violence should he lose the national election. The winner of this important election was Lula on the political left. So we add one more election to our ideological spectrum. Brazil goes there. However, as noted earlier, since Lula very often governs from the center, it's pretty safe to put Brazil in this category. What is clear is that Brazil is not going anywhere anytime soon, because while Lula won the national election, the political right dominates the parliament of Brazil. It's very unlikely that Lula will be able to force through much legislation in this third term in office. We now turn our attention to U.S. foreign policy towards the region, and we do so by recognizing not all issues fall into the same category. There are those issues that we can do very little to change, namely the outcome of Latin American elections. But then there are issues where we can promote change. We can change our policy and improve our position in the region, and in so doing, our perception in Latin America may well improve. It is clear that we're in a battle for this region's heart, not only South and Central America, but the Caribbean as well. China has targeted our hemisphere. It provides enormous amounts of development loans, gifts to countries, and political support if they will either provide access to their resources, such as lithium or oil or natural gas, or if they don't have natural resources, many countries in the Caribbean qualify here, those countries will vote with China in international organizations such as the United Nations. We as a nation cannot take this hemisphere for granted. James Reston, the famous New York Times editor and writer, once noted, Americans will do anything for Latin America except read about it. We need to change that behavior. We should study Latin America, learn about Latin America, understand its interests, its priorities, and its concerns, and alter our foreign policy in ways that change their perception of us. We cannot simply assume that China's rising clout in the region will decline. We must be proactive and win the battle for the hearts and the minds of the Latin American populations. So let's focus now on areas of policy that we can change. One of them is Cuba. We have sanctioned Cuba for more than 60 years. Almost no one in the world agrees with us or even understands why we do so. Our two neighbors, Canada and Mexico, wholeheartedly reject our approach to Cuba. The main reason our sanctions failed there is that other countries aren't joining us. But it's deeper than that. The goal of the sanctions in Cuba is not simple policy change from Havana, but regime change. We wanted the Castros gone. Today they are, but the Communist Party of Cuba still reigns supreme, and so our sanctions continue unabated. U.S. policy towards Cuba hurts our relationship with all of Latin America and the Caribbean, and it pays virtually no dividends, geostrategically, economically, or otherwise. Next is Brazil, a country that we had very close relationships with for the past 4 years. Now with the change to Lula, that may alter. Brazil is such a large and influential country. We should do everything in our power to remove many of the wrinkles in the fabric of the relationship. There's no logical reason for requiring Brazilians to have visas to enter the United States, and of course they counter that by requiring Americans to purchase costly visas to enter Brazil. It's such a minor issue, but it undermines the ability of both populations to travel to the other and engage in people-to-people exchanges. The plight of migrants is a very real sore spot. When they flow out of Venezuela, out of Honduras, Guatemala, and Mexico into the United States, our policies are viewed as inhumane. We're pushing them back across the Mexican border and forcing them to wait out our processing, living in squalor and abject danger of being assaulted by gangs and violent individuals. And then finally, there is our drug policy towards the region. We must acknowledge that we're a very big part of the problem. It is our demand of drugs that results in the massive flow of cocaine, marijuana, fentanyl, and other illegal substances through Mexico into the United States. We cannot simply blame those producers in those countries or the governments that enable them or look away as their policies allow for more drugs to flow to the United States. We need a more level-headed approach to our drug policy towards Latin America and the world in general. Shoring up these four areas would improve America's perception in Latin America and perhaps make us the role model that we really should be in this hemisphere. With that, I thank you again for joining me in this Great Decisions Master class. In week number 6, our attention turns to global famine. Stay engaged and make great decisions.
So the first thing I want to say, I think, is that the black tide preceded the red tide. The red tide that he described in 1959 was the Cuban Revolution. There were authoritarian governments throughout Latin America that we not only supported, but put in place. For example, the Somoza regime. And we're going to walk our way through some of that. But very good video in general, but what is democracy? What is authoritarianism? And that's one of the things we want to say. And at a crucial moment, he failed to use the I word, imperialism, which is exactly what our policy was. It went from being imperialistic to neo-imperialistic. And we'll talk about what that means. The Monroe Doctrine, as he said, basically said to the European states, you can't intervene in Latin America, but we can. And I would argue it started well before the Spanish-American War over Cuba that started in the Philippines. Think about that. Talk about global powers. The Spanish-American War over Cuba that started in the Philippines, and it also included Dominican Republic. In 1848, under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the United States took over 50% of Mexico from Mexico. And we drew a couple of straight line borders, a river, a straight line border, a Gadsden Purchase, and a couple more straight line borders. And one of the things we know is that straight line borders do not represent ethno-geographic realities. So we even have a province, we call them states, but they're really provinces, called New Mexico. And everything in California starts with a Santa Rosa. Yeah, Mexicans live here. Mexicans have been crossing that border on and off for centuries. In fact, during the Great Depression, the Roosevelt administration sent a lot of Mexicans back because we were short of workers. We were short of jobs, so we didn't need the workers. And when World War II started and the economy turned up, he opened the floodgates and imported workers because we needed workers. So that whole conversation about labor and workers is very much a political economy question as much as it is a human rights question. And speaking of migrants, will we take Haitian refugees? Not really. Do we take Cuban refugees? Absolutely, because we want to make the Castro government look bad. Talk about inconsistent policy. I thought I knew what I was doing relative to the global South. I'd been through Central America and been to North Africa. And then I went to Haiti. We're going to talk about Haiti a little bit later, but the depth and breadth of the poverty in Haiti is absolutely overwhelming and nothing like any other place in Latin America, except for maybe El Salvador. Even Guatemala and Honduras are not nearly as bad as places like Haiti. Has anybody been to Haiti? Yeah, you can't hardly go there now. There's so much instability. So I want to make the argument that Latin America has been subjected to both imperialism and neo-imperialism, which created a dependent relationship between the United States and Latin America. It started, of course, with a dependent relationship between Spain and Portugal and France and Great Britain, the other colonial powers, and the United States supplanted those colonial powers as the regional hegemon. And one of the things that the Monroe Doctrine and the Roosevelt Corollary did was create what we call a sphere of influence. A sphere of influence is defined as the geographic area over which a strong state dominates. The geographic area over which a strong state dominates. So when we think about the American sphere of influence, immediately upon the establishment of the 13 colonies, we started to expand our sphere of influence. First with the Louisiana Purchase, bam, and then a little bit more, bam, and then I'm from Oregon, the whole rush to Oregon, and then the California, bam. And then we put the Queen of Hawaii under house arrest for Dole pineapple. That's sphere of influence. The purchase of Alaska. Our sphere of influence extended during World War II all the way to Asia as we occupied Japan. Post-World War II, our sphere of influence still is in West Europe as we lead NATO and the expansion thereof. The Soviet Union wanted its own sphere of influence. They created the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics with the Russian Soviet Socialist Republic and 14 others. Ukraine was a part of that. Ukraine became sovereign in 1991. They had a moment of sovereignty in 1918 and another weird moment of sovereignty in 1945 where they were recognized in the UN General Assembly, but they really weren't. They were controlled by Moscow. Putin's Russia is now trying to re-establish its sphere of influence in Ukraine. The geographic area over which a strong state dominates. And I'll show you a map here coming up of that sphere of influence in the Caribbean and Latin America. So there's this dependent relationship between strong states and weak states. Japan extended its sphere of influence all the way into Manchuria and created the puppet state of Manchukuo in 1934. Yes, sir. Absolutely. Maquiladora. Yep.
And what he explained to me is the important stuff on you can improve these now with
I'll repeat it.
clouds,
Yep.
which is the old radar back. So what he does is he explains to somebody he brings stuff in from all over the world, trucks it to the port of Long Beach, across the border to Tijuana,
Yep.
or across the Laredo or Esmeralda. And I remember in 1964 they did a train to Richfield City, and first 26 miles into Laredo, they stopped. They said, "You are now entering Mexico." I thought I entered 26 miles. Yeah, I did.
Well, you did, but that's okay. Yeah. That's just when they decided to say it. Yeah.
They wanted to get that before passport. I said I had a tourist one. Beyond the 26-mile mark. Before that, you could do it if you want. Help me out. What am I talking about here? How does that?
Yeah, I'm going to shorten your question so that those that are watching virtually can watch this. What is a maquiladora and why are they important and how do they work? So a maquiladora technically is not a factory, it's an assembly plant. Remember when Ross Perot was running for president in 1992? And he said, what's this all about, this great big sucking sound? Remember how he could buy 90 minutes of primetime television because he was very wealthy? Well, Ross Perot was talking about NAFTA and how NAFTA was going to legitimize the sucking of American money and businesses and jobs down in Mexico. Well, Ross, he wasn't wrong, but he was about 30 years too late. That had already been happening. And a maquiladora is literally an assembly plant where items are shipped down there and assembled with really inexpensive Mexican labor. So under Carlos Salinas, who was president of Mexico, he created what they called the border industrialization policy that included a free trade zone, no environmental standards, cheap labor, no taxes. So Zenith and Volkswagen and a whole bunch of other American corporations went down there because they could maximize profit. That's neo-imperialism. And Jacuzzi evidently is another one. The working conditions are not great, but given the job situation in Mexico, many of them are coveted positions. And then problematically, for every job, 2 or 3 people show up. So there's a whole bunch of other people that are living outside Maquiladora under pretty poor living conditions with no running water. Sometimes, let me just say something about taxes. It really matters that toilets flush. having been to the global south a number of times. Paying taxes to have clean water and sewage is really a big deal, because if you don't, life expectancy drops off the table. So I'm willing to pay taxes for a few things, like toilets that flush, a fire department, public education, a little national defense, not national offense. Does that make sense? Yep. It really matters in places like Mexico. I hope that answered the question. We'll come back to that. I want to cover a little bit of more macro stuff first. I would argue, so this is a quick list of theses. First, Latin America has been subject to both imperialism and neo-imperialism. There's this dependent relationship. Much of Latin America, as the guy said, remains underdeveloped. And we spent a lot of time in one of my courses talking about what is development. And the argument is that development has to meet all three categories of political development, social development, and economic development. So we have places like Hungary that might be economically developed and socially developed, but with Orban in power, it's not maybe politically developed anymore. Places like Turkey. India is on the verge. So there are some countries that don't make that list. The other day in my introduction to international relations class called The World in Crisis, I had the students literally make a list. We got to about 45 or 50 countries out of 193 in the UN General Assembly that meet those conditions of development. We're talking about it very vaguely, but we can talk about some very specific variables relative to measuring development. But Latin America remains overwhelmingly underdeveloped. So I want to go through a few terms. I want to talk about what is democracy and what is authoritarianism, because he just threw those things out there. We're not sure what that are. We can do that pretty quickly. And then I want to make a few comments about the tides. The first of which is that the black tide happened before the red tide, and Castro's revolution of 1959 was in reaction to the authoritarian right-wing Batista government, which is part of that black tide. So I think he's off a little bit on that one. But I'm also, at the end of the hour, willing to discuss all kinds of things. I've been wrapped, unfortunately, since February of a while ago with the war in Ukraine, the illegal and immoral and unjust war in Ukraine that violates all kinds of not only justice of war, but justice in war. And of course, the since October 7th, immoral Hamas terrorist attack on Israel. And then, of course, Israelis' willingness to also violate international humanitarian law relative to the killing of civilians. The Palestinian people are being used by both sides. There's no doubt about that. That has nothing to do with being anti-Israel. I want to go on record as that. It's simply a commentary on Israeli foreign policy. Those are two different things. Let's be very clear. So I'm willing to talk about all those things at the end of the hour, but we do need to talk about Latin American politics. So when we talk about democracy, there are several types of democracy: direct, or what they call participatory democracy, kind of face-to-face. There's the one that we sort of have. We have a hybrid of representative and pluralistic democracy where we elect representatives that hopefully represent what we want them to say and do. Then there's parliamentary democracy. Most European democracies have this kind of system. For example, United Kingdom is both representative as well as parliamentary, where it's a unicameral system. The dominant party or coalition in the legislative body, like in Germany or the Bundestag, chooses the prime minister or the chancellor in the German case, and they're the chief executive. We have a separation of powers with the president, executive, and then, well, we don't have a speaker of the House. That's a whole other conversation. And then hopefully a checks and balances relative to all of that, and the establishment of judicial review, which was implied in our Constitution and not explicit, but established in 1803 with Marbury versus Madison, where the Supreme Court can rule laws unconstitutional. That's not the case in many Latin American places, unfortunately. The judiciaries sometimes have power and sometimes don't. And of course, over time, the American system became very much presidential, starting with Roosevelt, I would argue, FDR, and reaching its zenith with Nixon in the imperial presidency, backed off a bit with Carter and Ford and Carter, and then went right back up under ensuing presidents. France has very much a presidential system. The president of France can literally dissolve the National Assembly at any moment. Mexico has a presidential system dominated for its decades by the institutionalized Revolutionary Party. Haiti didn't have a democracy, but they had a presidential system, or rather an authoritarian one, led by Papa Doc Duvalier and eventually his son, Baby Doc. And we'll talk about that. So those are some of the types of democracies. Democracy is not a toggle. You don't just turn it on and it happens. It's a spectrum. Some places are more democratic than others. Some governments are more democratic than others. Ideally, though, it's when policy is formulated from the bottom up and where power itself flows from the bottom up. Power flows from the bottom up. Direct democracy includes individual participation in the decision-making process. Well, how often do we do that? Most of us vote every 2 years or on on some local elections a little more often than that. My argument to the 18 to 22-year-olds in college is voting is the lowest form of participation there is. Do it. Become engaged, become informed. It's the least you can do. I love hanging out with this crowd because you guys have been around the block, you know stuff. You wouldn't be here otherwise. You'd be playing cribbage or golf somewhere. Well, not in this weather, but you're interested in these things, and I always learn from you. Democracy also includes where there are clear choices on alternatives to policies and candidates. Clear choices, articulated policies. And one of the things we've seen in the last several years of American democracy is broad anti-that or anti-this without any real specific policy options. Democracy should have competitive elections. Those elections should be transparent. There should be a multi-party, at least 2 parties is a minimum, isn't it? And that's kind of what we have here. And certainly toleration and respect of opposing candidates. So I want to introduce, it's my job to always give you more reading. The midterms coming soon. He talked about hybrid systems. Levitsky and Way have this really good book called Competitive Authoritarianism. Hybrid regimes after the Cold War. We're going to talk about authoritarianism in a minute. But Levitsky, same guy, and Ziblatt wrote a really good book that's now required in every class I teach called How Democracies Die. I'm going to pass that around. You can get a copy for about $10. They wrote that for the public. It's not really an academic text, although they both teach comparative politics at Harvard. They're the real deal. They have a really important chart on page 24 about how democracies die. So one of the questions we ask in comparative politics is, how is it that democracies are formed and get better? Or how do democracies go from being democratic to being more authoritarian, and vice versa? How is it that authoritarian governments are formed and maybe get worse? And then how do authoritarian governments become more democratic? And it really matters on the rules of the game. Toleration and respect of opposing candidates and policies seems pretty straightforward, but we've lost a bit of that too, haven't we? We know democracies also by their protections of civil rights and liberties, and I'm not talking about just basic rights, but across the board, whether they're the basic civil rights of free speech, press, etc., religion, but also protection of minorities from the tyranny of the majority, and I'll get to that one in a second. But a free and independent, and I don't like to use the term media because media could be Facebook. Journalism, real journalism, where sources have to be cited, where if you recall the Woodward and Bernstein conversation with their editor, they had to have 3 sources before they could write anything about Nixon at the Washington Post. Real journalism, not just media. Free and independent journalism. And of course, no tyranny of the majority over the minority, and vice versa, no tyranny of the minority over the majority. In South Africa, the white Afrikaners were the minority tyrannizing the black majority. In the United States, under slavery, a white majority tyrannizing a black minority. Gender politics often play out this way, of tyranny of one group over another. In the genocide in Rwanda, the Hutu versus the Tutsi. In the genocides and civil wars of former Yugoslavia, Serbs versus Bosnian Muslims, for example. In Syria, the Alawite minority tyrannizing the majority other groups. It plays out in places like Afghanistan as well, where the Pashtun and other groups as minorities, but still they don't have a plurality, but they're in charge of other groups. Questions about democracy. It's really important that we know it when we see it and then how it fades. Authoritarianism, also not a toggle, but a spectrum. And the key here, I think, especially in the last few years, is recognizing authoritarian behavior when we see it. And that's what that book is about. Levitsky and Ziblatt, How Democracies Die. My son was a history and English major from Elmhurst College, who now works at the Baltimore Museum of Industry. He found that book in his Christmas stocking a few years ago. Poor kid. Our daughter's an artist. She wouldn't even open it. So that's a whole nother conversation. So recognizing authoritarian behavior when we see it, there is this idea of competitive authoritarianism that I refer to in that book, but certainly single party systems like Cuba. Cuba is a single party system. We know that very clearly. Interestingly, Castro was quite popular in the beginning. Problematically, in Cuba, they've never really had a democracy. So how do you start a democracy without a culture of democracy? And of course, in terms of the black tide that turned into the red tide, I'm flipping what they said in that video around. We supported Fulgencio Batista, the dictator of Cuba, under which the mafia ran Havana quite easily. And The Godfather, even though it's Hollywood, does document this moment. When Havana closed down, what opened up? Las Vegas. That's exactly right. They found another place to put those casinos because they're very profitable. Single party systems also include the former East Bloc, Soviet Union, China, although I argue China is no longer communist, they're quite capitalist. I said that to an historian colleague of mine, and he looked at me like I was crazy, but if you look at their policies, they are absolutely capitalist. Dictatorships, which can really range, certainly monarchies. I thought I knew what a monarchy was, and then I spent a couple of weeks in Saudi Arabia. Wow, that's a monarchy. We can talk more about that if you want. Full totalitarian systems like Mussolini's Italy or Hitler's Third Reich. That brings us to conversations about fascism. I would argue that Putin has recently gone from authoritarian to full totalitarian. Putin has gone from authoritarian to full totalitarian. And that's one of the reasons why it's important to put a check on that expansion. In their text, Levitsky and Way outline 3 or 4 major areas, beginning with unfair elections. Unfair elections. We know we can recognize authoritarian systems when we see unfair elections, where major candidates are barred, where independent or credible sources are abused, that try to document electoral abuse, they're barred, where the system tries to manipulate voter rolls to intimidate voters, where there's ballot box stuffing or falsification of the results. The phone call to Georgia, let's be clear, folks. I have voted for both parties in my lifetime. I've had great respect for the once proud party that freed the slaves. Under Trumpism, the Republican Party is very much a different bunch, unfortunately. And we lost a very good representative over this, Pete Meyer. And it was Fred Upton, your guy. Fred's a great guy. I've known Fred for years. Fred Upton, who decided, this isn't my party anymore. In Mexico, I have a good colleague that teaches at San Diego State who is an observer of Mexican elections. And he said, among other things, they vote by taco. They'll take one ballot, stuff it with a bunch of others, and slide it in. That was under the PRI. You'll notice that the guy on the video said Mexico became a democracy in 2000. Well, that was when the PRI finally lost an election and the National Action Party, or PAN, won. Interestingly, the guy that won the election was Vicente Fox, CEO of Coca-Cola, Mexico. He does not represent the average Mexican. I can guarantee that. And I'm not sure that Mexico really belongs back on that scale of democracy. But falsification of results, prevention of opposition from campaigning, using violence against them, abusing election laws, bias toward incumbency are all unfair election attributes of authoritarian behavior. Harassment or elimination of independent. So then the next category is violation of civil liberties. Harassment or elimination of independent journalism, restricting or attacking freedoms of association or speech, attacking or delegitimizing opposition figures or other government critics, creating states of emergency. You see this throughout Latin America. You saw this in Egypt, for example. Mubarak came in and said, well, we got to have a state of emergency. And the guy was there until from the early 1990s until the Arab Spring of 2011. Repression of civic or oppositional groups. You see literally in Russia, the jailing of opposition. Navalny's in jail, the main opposition group. We see this with many examples in Latin America. And of course, tyranny of the majority or the minority and vice versa, as opposed to protection of the minority or majority against the other. How about just not holding elections? Canceling elections, putting off elections. Haiti, we'll talk about Haiti a little bit later, but they're supposed to have elections this year. They still haven't been scheduled. It's going on November. There won't be elections in Haiti before the end of the year. Illegal or extra-constitutional use of the military. When we mean constitutional, we mean rule of law. So it's pretty important when we see leaders saying, like Milley, I have a duty to the Constitution. What he's really saying is rule of law. That's pretty darn important. That has not been the case. Let's talk, and I got a slide coming up a little later, but let's go ahead and go right to Chile, the other 9/11, 1973. September 11th, 1973, a major coup in Chile. I mean, people familiar with this one? Yeah. So Salvador Allende was a medical doctor. He'd been a senator for 30-some years. He was elected president in 1970. Chile had several good elections in a row. The president serves a 6-year term. He was elected in 1970. By 1973, the line out of the Nixon administration was make the economy scream, because they didn't want the pink tide to be successful. So I'm arguing the pink tide also started well before what they said in this video, post-Cold War 1990. They did not want Allende to be successful, even though a number of military leaders, including General Schneider, had said, yep, this election was clean. It was a runoff. It was very close. Allende barely won, but it was close. And what happened in 73? General Augusto Pinochet, one of the 20th century's absolute worst thugs, overthrew Pinochet. And civil rights and liberties dropped off the table in Chile. So that can be both domestic or foreign. One of the things that presidents often do as commander-in-chief is use the military for foreign policy to enhance their popularity. We've seen this in a number of cases, ranging from invading Grenada after the Marines were blown up in Lebanon, to Putin's attempt to invade, the Soviet Union's attempt to invade Afghanistan and enhance their popularity. And boy, that one did not pay off after 8 years. That was on Christmas Eve of '79. Certainly, we know authoritarianism when we see physical violence, imprisonment, exiles, assassinations, attacks on offices or infrastructure, or the use of paramilitary for the above. Everybody remembers January 6th? Pretty straightforward there, I think. Yep. So how do we know it when we see it? You'll see in the chart in Levitsky and Ziblatt, and I don't want to go through it, maybe at the end of the hour as we pass this book around, there's literally when we know when candidates are becoming more authoritarian when they do some of these things. And they got a great chart on that page. We'll come back to that. Levitsky and Ziblatt, How Democracies Die. Any questions about democracy versus authoritarianism? Quick break. Excellent. So the video talked about independence. In international relations, we use the term sovereignty. He's not wrong. Most of Latin America became sovereign, particularly around 1823, although the first sovereign state south of the border was Haiti, 1803-04. Why Haiti? Anybody? Yeah, it was, he said, didn't they take over the French? Yes, it was literally a slave revolt based on the American Revolution. The Haitian Revolution of 1803, led by Toussaint Louverture and a guy by the name of Dessalines. They both dressed just like Napoleon. Kind of funny. Did the United States recognize Haitian independence? Based on our ideology, we should have. We didn't, because it was a slave revolt. And I think Tom Jefferson owned slaves. Yep. We didn't want that slave revolt to extend to the economy of the American South. So Haiti is actually the New World's second oldest republic. The New World, which is also a European construct, right? The New World, been here well before Chris showed up, whenever Chris showed up. I've been here a lot, much longer than that. A European construct was created by Europeans, the 13 original colonies. That's an aberration. And those colonies formed a state, and the state continued to expand. By state, I mean the United States, not province. So all states want sovereignty. What do we mean by sovereignty? Literally, no higher authority. In the case of Haiti, they were subjected to significant economic reparations and payments to France. It began their underdevelopment. First, they weren't recognized as being sovereign. Secondly, it cost them a lot of money, and they didn't have money to give. While a slave economy, the island of Hispaniola, under the French rule, was the wealthiest colony going because of one particular policy. Rather than keeping slaves alive, the French simply let them die and imported more. It was grossly inhumane. Once those slaves gained independence, they did not receive recognition as being sovereign and had to pay significant reparations. And it cost them, it still costs them today. May he rest in peace. The important infectious disease doctor from Harvard, Paul Farmer, who has a PhD in anthropology, who just passed away a couple years ago, wrote a book called Pathologies of Power. Anybody familiar with Paul Farmer? Here's some Christmas reading for you. Anything by Paul Farmer. He wrote one of the best history books on Haiti called The Uses of Haiti. I met Paul first down in the Artibonite Valley at an outfit called Partners in Health. He started clinics in the Global South, particularly in Haiti, working out of Harvard. He ran in circles that I'll never even dream of touching. I don't want those circles. But Paul Farmer was the absolute real deal. Again, a PhD in medical anthropology and an MD out of Harvard. And documents how Haiti has been underdeveloped the whole time. And of course, by the 1957, Papa Doc Duvier was in place, and he was our guy because Papa Doc was anti-communist. Papa Doc Duvier had his opposition's heads delivered to him in buckets of ice, documented in Elizabeth Abbott's fine book called The Duviers. He had a death squad called the Tonton Macoud. That was absolutely brutal, and he was our ally. Papa Doc died in 1971, and Baby Doc took over at about age 18 or 19. It was at that point that Haiti devolved into what we call a narco-kleptocracy. A government that steals, a kleptocracy is a government that steals, and a narco is a government that runs drugs. Wow, not a great place for development. They wanted sovereignty. They were very much under the thumb of American influence. Imperialism, we talked about that a little bit, and overt U.S. imperialism. So the video mentioned some good history, but I want to reemphasize this term U.S. imperialism, from the Roosevelt corollary, the Monroe Doctrine, to this idea of spheres of influence. The United States literally took Panama from Colombia to create the canal. The original canal was supposed to go through Lake Nicaragua under the Boone-Alvaria Treaty. That didn't happen. A lot of people were dying of malaria. There were bad bugs, etc. That didn't happen. So we snagged Panama, and it pretty much occupied Panama ever since with our Marines. Many of my peers have become members of the military service, and they often spent time in either South Korea or Panama protecting that canal. So here's, I don't know if you can see that or not, but this is just a list of U.S. interventions and occupations, starting with 1898, the Spanish-American War over Cuba. In Cuba, U.S. troops, 1898 to 1902, 1906 to 1909, 1917 to 1922, a protectorate. We literally ran Cuba. They did not have sovereignty. So the idea of that first war, the Spanish-American War over Cuba, was to give Cuba sovereignty. They didn't have it. They were clearly under the control of the United States. The same with Haiti, the island of Hispaniola, which is this one right here, divided between now Dominican Republic and Haiti, was also occupied. The U.S. ran their economy from about the mid-19-teens to the 1930s. Haiti did not enjoy economic or political sovereignty. Of course, many interventions, and he listed a few in the video, in Nicaragua, for example. Guatemala, El Salvador, of course, Mexico City. Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, we own. Virgin Islands, we own. And the canal. U.S. sphere of influence, pretty overt imperialism. What was it Teddy Roosevelt said? Speak softly and carry a big stick. Yep. Teddy was a bit of an enigma, wasn't he? He regulated the meatpacking industry. He put a lot of land away. He was a conservationist. He was also an imperialist. Pretty straightforward. Question, sir? Oh, yeah. Took it, carved it, put in the canal. Yeah. And I tell my students, don't believe anything I say, check it out. Because they don't know much history. And I end up teaching a lot of history. So the question was, did we actually steal Panama? Sorry to those on the line. Did we actually steal Panama from Colombia? Pretty much. It was a treaty, but we went down and occupied it and said, this is ours. And then created Panama. Not unlike Japan did with Manchukuo when they invaded China in the 1930s. They had a fake, they faked a railroad bombing and blamed it on the Chinese and said, oh, we're going to create the puppet state of Manchukuo in Manchuria so they could occupy and get those natural resources. Yes, sir. Oh, eventually we gave Panama back to Manuel Noriega. The question was, did we give Panama back? And yes, they are now semi-fully sovereign. I'm going to use that language, right? Sovereignty is also not a toggle because there are strong states and there are weak states. Legally, all 193 members of the UN General Assembly are sovereign states. But in terms of power, they're not all equally sovereign. It's that line of out of Orwell. We're all equal, but some are more equal than others. Similar dynamic. And of course, we know that Palestine has observer status and is not one of those 193 recognized sovereign states. They have observer status because they don't have borders. Let's real quickly. Let me define what a state is when we say a state. A state is a government that has defined borders and enjoys the legal status of sovereignty. Other countries have recognized it, and maybe that sovereignty comes from within. So the United States created its own sovereignty by way of the 13 colonies articulating a Declaration of Independence, and then 13 years later, a constitution. That's what a state is. So when we say Texas, we really mean a province. Texas, we're the United Provinces of Middle North America. Yeah, the United Provinces of Middle North America, where states are sovereign actors, independent. Yeah, go pass that back up here. Yes, sir. Right. Or not, why there's no road into the Columbia. Oh, that's a good question. The question was, you can't drive all the way. Well, you gotta get out of the canal, don't you? You gotta go around the canal. Yeah. I don't know the answer to that. That's an excellent question. Well, there's anybody familiar with the Darien Gap? Yeah, that's where those people are trying to come through that really dense space, dense jungle from South America into Central America eventually. Yeah. I don't know the answer to that. That's an excellent question. And so if this were the class, I'd say find that out for Thursday to empower the students. Great question. Yes, sir. Why were we in Nicaragua 3 times? We didn't like their governments. They wouldn't do what we told them to do. And in the 1930s, who took over? Our guy Somoza. We're going to talk about Anastasia Somoza that lasted until 1979. Absolute dictatorship. We'll talk about that. So we see all these examples of imperialism, and I would argue that U.S. overt imperialistic control of the political economy in just about every corner of Central America and the Caribbean eventually created significant opposition to the United States. We were supporting, let's go back to his tides, black tide. We were supporting authoritarian governments mostly to maximize profit. We could talk about very specifically the case of Guatemala, where United Fruit Company showed up and literally began buying land, and campesinos then didn't have it, and we ran the government. We will talk about Guatemala. So I would argue U.S. foreign policy from 1945 on, really the age of neo-colonialism or neo-imperialism. We emerged from World War II as the dominant state. We were the beacon of democracy and the beacon of hope. We helped defeat fascism. holding off single-party authoritarian systems like the Soviet Union. That's all good, and that's all real. But to our sphere of influence, we weren't nearly as benevolent. We created the Organization of American States, which is a collective security arrangement. A collective security means an attack on one is an attack on all. NATO is a collective security arrangement. But the Organization of American States was supposed to be much more than that. And those other Latin American states that were members of the OAS didn't quite have equal footing as the United States. And we literally involved ourselves in a number of cases, beginning with support of the Somoza regime in Nicaragua in the 1930s to the coup in Guatemala in 1954. So the age of neo-imperialism or neo-colonialism, where we didn't go down and occupy, but we manipulated who was in charge of the governments. In Cuba, it was Batista, for example. So I want to add another purpose to American foreign policy that was not mentioned in the video. The purpose is economic gain and exploitation and profit. There's nothing wrong with making profit. The question is if there's too much exploitation and gain. And in the case of Guatemala, it was bananas over democracy, very straightforwardly. We could talk about that. So in a number of cases, the US actually assaulted democracy, and this is the black tide, often in the name of anti-communism, aka the red tide, so that communism wouldn't make a foothold there in an effort to create the conditions for profitability. Like the Dole family in Hawaii, the United States installed a military government in Guatemala in 1954. They had a number of dictators, including a guy named Ubico, which was quite a fascist that we liked and then we didn't like in the 1930s. And then post-World War II in Guatemala, they had an election. And a guy by the name of Arbenz was elected. And Arbenz wanted corporations to pay taxes because he had roads to build and schools to fill with children. And one of the companies that he went after was United Fruit Company. John Foster Dulles, our Secretary of State, and his brother Alan Dulles, head of the CIA, and General Walter Beadle Smith sat on the boards of directors of United Fruit Company. I'm sorry, Alan Dulles and Beadle Smith sat on the board of directors. John Foster Dulles, his legal firm, helped drop some of the original agreements. He was not on the board of directors. But when Arbenz began to charge United Fruit Company fair taxes, he was promptly overthrown in a coup, and that was in 1954, and the military took over. Democracy died. What little semblance there was in Guatemala died. And Guatemala suffered then a 36-year civil war from 1960 to 1996. And I got a slide on that I want to go through. So my point is that all of this, part of this anti-communism, created localized opposition to US foreign policy. And that played out in Nicaragua in their revolution of 1979, which we could talk about as well. So from Batista to Castro, the embargo is absolutely failed policy. Who is the embargo for? I would argue the embargo is for anti-Castro Cubans in Little Havana. Yeah, I would argue, yeah, in the suburbs of Miami. Yep. Because it's absolutely failed policy. Now, it doesn't mean we should support single-party systems. Oh, wait, Saudi Arabia. Oh, wait, China. Not that we support China now, but we certainly did for a long time. Remember Nixon and ping pong diplomacy, sending Forrest Gump over to play ping pong? We have supported a number of single-party authoritarian systems. Why not Castro? Because Castro gave it to us in 1959. And then 2 years later, ponied up to the Russians and threatened to put missiles. That was a big deal. Kennedy said there's a 1 in 3 chance we'll engage in nuclear war. Wow. Now, of course, we never fell behind the Cubans militarily. I'm sorry, the Russians militarily. We had our own missiles aimed from Turkey and Pakistan. In fact, we took down some. And when did the US win the Cold War? I would argue not in the 1980s, but right then. The Soviet Union had to take their missiles out, and got turned around in the Caribbean. And it was at that point they tried to match the US missile for missile, and their economy couldn't do it. And it really showed up when they couldn't handle that brutal war that they had, the 8-year war they had in Afghanistan from late 1979 to 1988. That was It's a little simplistic to say they're Vietnam, but it was kind of their Vietnam. Yep. The U.S. won the Cold War right then and there in the Caribbean, articulating a sphere of influence with a naval blockade. There are many arguments. One of my first public talks way back in 1996 was at the opening of a Cuban art exhibit at the Downtown Art Museum in Grand Rapids. And I decided to say, well, let's give the 11 reasons why we should lift the embargo. There are many of them. American businesses are ready to invest. It's absolutely failed policy. The last vote in the UN General Assembly was, I think, 188 or 89 to 3, with a couple of extensions to lift the embargo, with a couple of abstentions, I'm sorry. Also, the enhancement of the embargo under the Clinton administration really violates international law. It's a secondary embargo. It tells countries that they can't do business with Cuba if they do business with the United States. Well, they're sovereign states and they can do anything they want. And this is what's really upsetting our European allies. Guatemala, here's the coup. This is very important. I described the coup already a few minutes ago. It was absolutely financed for and by United Fruit Company. Check that out. There's a real good book, in fact, by two guys, Kinzer and Schlesinger, called Bitter Fruit, that documents all of this. I've got a whole bunch of other ones. Any basic text on Central American politics will document this. And then this absolutely brutal 36-year civil war in Guatemala that resulted in Los Desaparecidos. Now, I know some of you have better Spanish than I do. Our daughter, the art student, was in Spanish immersion from preschool on, and she was absolutely my correction mistress. Every time I said it wrong, she fixed it. But it's basically the disappeared ones. There is a generation and a half of people who disappeared in Guatemala and children who grew up without parents. You wonder why gangs are taking over in Guatemala? Part of it is our lack of American U.S. support. Not all of it. One of the reasons is a lack of American support for democracy in places like Guatemala that are vastly underdeveloped politically and socially. Very underdeveloped. I thought things were bad when I first arrived in Guatemala, and then I went to Haiti. I think Haiti's next. Yep. From the Duvalier regimes to the coups of the 1980s, we talked about a narco-kleptocracy, the poorest economy in the Western Hemisphere. On a daily basis, not a weekly basis, not a monthly basis. On a daily basis, a large portion of the Haitian public is looking for food, looking to pay things off. Yeah, that's funny. And some have had to resort to what we call geophagy, eating dirt. They make they find some clay, they mix it with a little oil and some weeds, they dry it out into little dried biscuits of clay, and that's food. It is a source of some protein, particularly for women who are pregnant, but that's how bad things are in Haiti. And coup after coup after coup. I remember when the earthquake hit Haiti, and there was one not simultaneously, but about the same time in Japan. And the argument I made at the time was Japan will eventually recover. The earthquake was brutal. Haiti not. They don't have any building codes. Do you know how places that build with bricks need rebar? There's no rebar in Haiti. Everything just fell. You saw pictures of even the presidential palace falling down. That image alone tells you about both the political as well as the economic devastation of Haiti. Amazingly, in 1990, Jean-Bertrand Aristide, former Catholic liberation theology priest, was elected president. I teach Aquinas, but I'm not Catholic. But I've learned a lot about what goes on down in some of these places, particularly with reference to just war theory. And he was promptly overthrown in a coup, half sponsored by the United States. He won the election back and was overthrown a second time. And then we supported a colonel named Raul Cedras, who maintained military control over Haiti. And that evolved from a narco-kleptocracy in the 1980s to gang violence, et cetera, in the 1990s. And to this day, Haiti has had a hard time just holding elections. I remember the fourth time I flew into Haiti, coming into Port-au-Prince, there's the airport, and there was a kind of a newer building, and on the top of the building, it had the blue UN, which meant I knew there was a peacekeeping force there, but that's where the United Nations peacekeeping force was. That's not a bad thing. At least I know where to go if something happens. Because the relationship between law and order and the military is a very tenuous one in Haiti. Grossly underdeveloped in political, economic, and social sense. We talked a little bit about Somoza. I want to talk about the 30-some year reign of the Somoza regime under Anastasio, the dad, and then two sons that were eventually overthrown in 1979. Well, I was born in 1962, and I remember, for some reason, very vividly, I grew up in rural Southern Oregon, and in 1972, there was a drive to donate things to the kids of Nicaragua because there was an earthquake. It was a devastating earthquake, and I gave away my coat. They said, "Oh, we'll take anything." And I went home and got in real trouble with my mom because that was a new coat. She said, "Roger, you have old coats. You could have given one of those." Well, I didn't know. I was just trying to help out the kids in Nicaragua. I didn't even know where Nicaragua was. That earthquake began the political opposition to the authoritarian Somoza regime that we supported. Later, I learned that a number of Americans had donated blood through the Red Cross. The blood was sent down to Nicaragua, and the Somoza regime was charging their public for the donated blood. So we got the term vampire government out of the Somoza regime. That's how bad it was. And of course, who took over? Daniel Ortega with the Sandinistas, a left-wing organization. They won the revolution very clearly. They also won the next election. They won the next election, number one, because they were legit and they were popular. They represented the peasants. And because, number two, nobody else participated in the election because they knew they were going to win. They made the election look less legitimate. Daniel Ortega, to his credit at that time, held another election in which, who's the guy that ran the newspaper? There was a family that ran the newspaper. The guy that ran it was killed, and his wife, Violeta Chamorro, is that right? Yep. Won the next election. Ortega stepped aside, the leader of the left-wing Sandinistas. Well, roll about 20 years later, Daniel Ortega comes back, and he's not letting go of power. That's problematic. He went from being a lefty, little d Democrat, going along with rule of law and democracy, and really helping out the average campesino or peasant is the Central American term for one without land, to now being authoritarian. That's very problematic. But I want to talk for a minute about Iran-Contra. The Ortega-Sandinista regime was quite legitimate democratically or domestically in Nicaragua at the time in the early 1980s. And a group emerged, no longer under the control of Somozas, but a right-wing group called the Contras. The Contras were so bad that both Democrats and Republicans in Congress, the House and the Senate, said, we can't fund the Contras. They're death squads. And the Reagan administration saw the world in very myopic black and white terms, us versus them, and found a way to fund the Contras. And here's the 50-cent version. You got Iran and Iraq going at it after the 1979 Iran Revolution. We're supporting Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein was our guy until he wasn't. You've got a civil war in Nicaragua between the Sandinistas and the government that they established and a small group called the Contras. We weren't supposed to fund the Contras. Oliver North, among others, Seacourt, Poindexter, and a few others under the Reagan administration, found an Israeli arms dealer through which they sold weapons to Iran, our enemy, the province of which to illegally fund the Contras. And Oliver North serves time after shredding a whole bunch of papers. Never went upstairs. Well, Reagan wanted, yeah, right. I'm pretty sure that Daddy Bush, former head of the CIA, knew exactly what was going on. Smart guy. He was a really smart guy. I'm saying something about his son, but that's a whole other conversation. I'll pick on Democrats at every moment. I did not have sexual relations with that woman. Yes, sir.
I just make a comment only because of what you just said. 2014, I had a driver take me for 10 days around Nicaragua. Man,
This isn't working because your comments are so long
sorry.
that he can't.
Yeah, we got about 10 minutes, so
Okay.
let's do it at the end of the hour, real
Yes.
quick. Yep,
Thank
yep. Yeah, Nicaragua remains divided, and to this day, under the now Ortega's back in power and not democratic, very authoritarian, problematic. In El Salvador, one of the most underdeveloped overt and covert support for military regimes. This is part of the black tide. severe political repression, significant social and economic underdevelopment, and of course, the assassination of Archbishop Oscar Romero in 1980. It's Hollywood, but it's a heck of a film, probably Raul Julia's finest moment. One of the other classes I get to teach is called Hollywood Cinema and Power. We watch movies. Learned a lot. It's Hollywood, but based on the true story of what happened to Archbishop Romero and the Maryknoll sisters. Assassinated by a right-wing death squad supported by tangentially the United States. We talked about Nicaragua under Samoa. So this is a big list. Nicaragua, Guatemala, El Salvador, Panama, Haiti, and Chile. We already talked about Chile. They're not coming soon. So the black tide, I think, preceded the red tide and then happened during the red tide also in reaction to it. And the video said something about under the black tide, but they had economic development. Well, for certain sectors of the economy, the idea of economic growth has to be countered with really high levels of inequality, very low human development numbers. The UN has what they call the HDI, the Human Development Index. And during that time, much of Central America and the Caribbean had very low human development index numbers and virtually no civil rights and liberties. So there might have been some economic growth among some sectors. In Chile, they did. The wine business took off, and of course, the copper industry, which is one of the reasons for the coup, remained profitable, but for only certain sectors. There's that. I would argue, though, that the video said the peak tide started in the 1990s. I would argue it began in the late 1970s, early 80s with the Sandinista victory of the Nicaraguan Revolution of 1979. The peak tide, let's talk about this for just a second. For much of the region's history, formal electoral contestations excluded leftist movements because of American foreign policy. Through limited suffrage, through military intervention, et cetera, we just talked about much of that. But in the late 1990s in particular, and they mentioned Hugo Chavez of Venezuela, Lula of Brazil, Evo Morales, AKA the Three Musketeers of the left in South America. Very real. Very real. Meaning they were all, they had similar domestic policies, they agreed with one another, they supported one another, and they were elected all about the same, relatively around the same time, and they represented this pink tide. Yeah. Certainly Chavez and Lula were more significant across the board, but not only did they focus on those affected by the vast inequality, but they also catered to outside investments, which was interesting. Farard, Laurelette, Long, and Lustig, one of the things we academics do is read studies, have an article called The Pink Tide and Income Inequality in Latin America, published by Cambridge University just last spring. And they argue that from the early 2000s to around 2012, Latin American countries experienced significant reduction in income inequality. So the pink tide helped the average Latino, if you will. They quote, the average Gini coefficient, and Gini is simply a way to measure inequality, domestic inequality, fell from those numbers. The period of falling inequality coincided with the leftist presidents that we just described. By 2009, 11 of the 17 countries, and they talked about that in the video, had leftist presidents, the so-called pink tide, which meant that they were trying to make things less unequal domestically. The study, they go on, finds evidence that leftist governments lowered income inequality faster than non-leftist regimes, blah, blah, blah. Not a bad thing, except some of them became entrenched politically and wouldn't give up power. So there might have been some social development, and they were elected democratically, but once in office, they didn't want to give up power. That's a problem. And that's a problem on both the left and the right in Latin America. The lack of political development, the lack of democracy that we operationalized a few moments ago. So let's turn ourselves to current elections really quickly. They mentioned elections. I wanted to get more specific. They just kind of, in these countries, and they put little dots over those countries. Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, Guyana, and Bolivia had elections in 2020. In Chile, Honduras, Mexico, Tobago, Nicaragua, Honduras, and Argentina had elections in 2021. In 2022, of course, Brazil, Colombia, and Costa Rica. And by the way, Costa Rica is the exception. Has anybody been a tourist in Costa Rica? Yeah, that's the safe place to go. It's a good place to go. There's nothing wrong with it. They somehow managed to outlaw their military and don't have to spend the money on it. Well, the Organization of American States, i.e. the United States, helps provide the military umbrella for Costa Rica, but they are developed in every sense. Election is 2023. Guatemala, we went through that. And of course, Cuba, only one party, and Haiti, not going to happen. So I want to talk a little bit. Oh, here's the elections coming up in 2024. I want to talk a little bit about Brazil for just a few minutes. He used different language. I've heard the language Trump of the tropics. He says some really horrible things about gender and homosexuality. I've got 5 kids, but on the 5th, I had a moment of weakness and it came out a woman. How'd you like that for a dad? The scum of the earth is showing up in Brazil if we don't have enough problems on our own to sort it out. They do nothing. He's talking about descendants of slaves. They're not even good for procreation. Bolsonaro is an out-and-out racist. It's pretty straightforward. That's his picture. We saw him. President from that time period lowered protections for indigenous groups in the Amazon rainforest, increased deforestation. His COVID-19 response was overtly criticized, downplaying the pandemic. And of course, Brazil's death toll was as high as anybody's per capita. It was really brutal because he didn't follow the science, essentially. Overtly homophobic, lost to Lula in those elections. And we'll talk about Lula in a second. And his voters, of course, pulled a January 6th, when it was January 8th, stormed the federal government buildings calling for a coup. Anti-democratic. That's how democracies die. Rule of law. There's nothing wrong with recounting ballots. Georgia, recount them 6 times. Arizona, get it right. There's nothing wrong with recounting ballots. Make sure it's accurate. But once they've been certified by your own party, it's pretty kind of a done deal. You got to give it to that Georgia Secretary of State. A phone call from the president for an hour, find me exactly this number of votes. Wow. Even Lyndon Johnson didn't do that. And Johnson was pretty undemocratic. The Johnson treatment. So earlier this summer, the Superior Electoral Court blocked Bolsonaro from seeking election because he constantly lied about the election. He just said stuff. And he said, I'm not going to follow the outcome of the election no matter what. So the elections in Brazil were held in 2022. They were so close that they had to have a runoff. So there was 5 or 6 candidates. The top 2, nobody got a majority. There was a plurality. So the top 2, of course, back to Lula and Bolsonaro. And Lula won. Lula comes, I'm going to say some good and bad here, comes from a working class family during the military dictatorships. Again, Brazil suffered pretty undevelopment politically. Helped start the Workers' Party, pushed for democratic legislation. But he was 0 for 2 running for president a couple of times. Finally elected in 2002 in a runoff and reelected in 2006. Had some good reforms, reduced public debt, over 20 million Brazilians brought out of poverty, lowered inequality, lowered unemployment, etc. But he took some bribes, pretty well documented, served some prison time, and used his own political party to get out of office. So again, there's these moments of increasing democracy, but then retrenchment back to authoritarian behavior on all sides. On all sides. I'm going to skip Mexico real quick and get to some conclusions. I got a whole conversation here about Mexico and AMLO. We can come back to it if we want. In Argentina, I do want to have you know there's 2 major candidates in that. I mean, this just happened over the weekend and yesterday. Massa, who is currently the Minister of the Economy, pretty seasoned guy, kind of a straightforward center-left, maybe I don't know, not really left, center, normal, kind of a normal guy. And then this guy, I took this right from the New York Times, described as the Argentinian mashup of Trump, Bolsonaro, and Johnson, far-right populist, ultra-conservative, anti-liberal is what that should say. Gained notoriety by consistent and constant TV appearances where he criticized everybody. Just calling people criminals. While he was a member of the Congress, he showed up for barely 50% of the time and passed no legislation. So as a politician or as a lawmaker, not very effective. Well, everybody thought he was going to actually win, but after leading in the polls for months, Millier, a far-right libertarian economist, tumbled to second place in the presidential election. This is just on last Sunday, 2 days ago. This is Tuesday. Yep. Sending him to a runoff, and will face Massa, Argentinia's center-left economics minister. We'll see what happens. That'll be taking about a month. There's a really good article that I found just this morning. So I had to send Ian 2 versions of this because I added this slide. 5 takeaways from Argentina's election that I had to recommend in the New York Times just this morning. 5 takeaways, and it'll describe things. So quick conclusions. Democracy in Latin America is still fragile. Political development is still a work in progress. Social and economic underdevelopment remains. There remain significant differences from Costa Rica to El Salvador and Haiti. Talking about Latin America as a monolith is not fair. It's very complex, and there's a lot of differences. Brazil's economy is very different. They have resources. In Guatemala, a banana republic. There are many problems remain, including the disempowered populations. There's an elite that still controls much of political economy in Latin America. There's still significant economic dependency on the U.S., as they showed in that one pie chart. The U.S. military is still crucial. And here's a picture of some other U.S. interventions. And while the impact of U.S. neo-imperialism has certainly decreased, is Chinese neo-imperialism on the rise? And I would say likely. I want to do a little more homework before I say much more about that. Authoritarianism is and always has been prevalent in many governments, and civil rights and political rights are constantly threatened. That remains the big picture of Latin America. So with that, we're out of time, but I'll field any questions for any time, whether we can talk about Latin America, the war in Ukraine, or the situation in Hamas. Thank you very much. A lot of stuff.
If you have questions, I will come around.
Yeah, I'll hang for a while. My wife is getting her flu shot this afternoon at Costco at 4:45. I got to be back by 4.
Oh, well, I don't think.
I got mine earlier. I hang out with
Okay.
colleagues.
I think we have a question back here.
Ian promised me dinner later, so I'm.
Given the fact that Haiti shares the same island with the Dominican Republic, how has the Dominican Republic been able to stay not as,
Underdeveloped.
underdeveloped
yeah.
as Haiti is?
Everybody hear that question? Yeah. Well, the differences between Dominican Republic and Haiti. First, I think there's a racial issue. Haiti is made up of Black African former slaves, and they don't stand as high on many countries' priority list. I think it's quite racist. Our policy toward Cuba, we'll take them all because we want to make Castro look bad, but we won't take political refugees from Haiti. And the political refugees from Haiti have just as much to complain about as the Cuban political refugees. Dominican Republic has had significant support from the United States. There was a U.S. intervention in the early 1960s. It involved a guy by the name of Balaguer. You got to take a look at my lecture notes, where we involved ourselves in that situation and established governments favorable to us. They also have a lot more in common with, say, other North American Latinos, Dominican Republic. So they've also been able to take advantage of some investments like maquiladora. There are maquiladora in Dominican Republic. At one point, a lot of baseballs were hand sewn in Dominican Republic. Imagine what that does to your knuckles. If you pull up Google Earth or Google Maps and look at what's been going on, you see significant deforestation in Haiti just because they need to cut down trees for fuel, and less in Dominican Republic. So there's just an overt level of different economic policy. But on the island, there's also significant animosity. In the 1930s, there's part of the southern border between Haiti and Dominican Republic, there's a river. And there was a massacre of Haitians that tried to get across the border to get to DR because it was a better place. And Some have called it genocide. I'm not sure it reaches that operational definition according to the UN law and the work by Samantha Power and others on genocide, but significant animosity, both in terms of the nation and race. I hope that gives a bit of an answer to your question. It's complex. There's a lot of stuff going on there. Yeah. Carol's in charge.
I just wanted to ask you about Bolivia. My daughter was a missionary for 20 years in South America, and they ended up in Bolivia. And when Morales came in, he was like Trump, said he didn't lose state. So the citizens protested with cars, buses in all the streets, and no commerce. And they can't sell their house. They have a farm.
Yep.
They can't sell. And the government, American government, told all the missionaries they had to leave. It wasn't safe
Get out
anymore.
of town. Yep.
So I don't know if that's changed because a few years ago.
I
Or
don't
it's
think
still
it's changed
bad.
much. Yeah. I didn't do a deep dive on Bolivia. I apologize. I'm in the middle of teaching Latin American politics this semester, and Bolivia is coming up and updating my notes. But I had my students do it for me. That's the way it works. You empower them to get information. But I think it's remained about the same. So Bolivia, I can speak to the history of that, though, remains one of those places where a populist comes in, is democratically supported, and then it retrenches into less democratic behavior. And that was Morales. Some people gained with some short-term policies, but a lot of people didn't. And the how democracies die conversation takes place. Yeah. They don't, unfortunately, one pattern, it's a generalization, but one pattern is once they're in power, they want to eliminate opposition. Well, that's not a democracy. You got to go by the election outcomes. And that's Bolivia. Not Ecuador. Ecuador is quite a different, Ecuador, yeah. I bet she could speak very specifically to the differences between Bolivia and Ecuador. Yeah, great question. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, lots of weaponry, unfortunately.
In Mexico, how much control does the government have versus the cartel?
Yeah, great question. The New York Times had an article just this morning about 13 more judicial/police people being killed. So let's talk about Mexico for a second. We went over them very quickly in the slide. They had a revolution from roughly 1911 to 1917 where they got a new constitution. And on paper, the Constitution looked great, but it retrenched back into a strong presidency that they had before that under the Porfiriato era. And then in the 1930s, a guy by the name of Cardenas won election. He was very popular, but he started what was called the Institutionalized Revolutionary Party. Well, it was anything but, except institutionalized. And they dominated elections for the next 70 years, from the 30s till 2000. So on the one hand, an entrenched single party system where they just ran their candidate and won. And in 1996, for example, they tried to literally turn off the electricity because they didn't want everybody to count the ballots because they thought they were going to lose. My buddy Dave at San Diego State was one of the election observers on that one. Professor Dave Carruthers, I should give him full due, is a Latin American specialist at San Diego State. And problematically, and he's not wrong about the Americans being the source of the problem. That was a cocaine thing. Sorry, but you guys got that one. They have power, and there's money behind that drug trade, and it's really problematic. And if you're a law enforcement officer in Mexico, you want to be safe. And too many judges and police officers get paid off because it's safer and you make more money on the take. Hey, another book I want to share is a book called Courage, Resistance, and Women in Juarez, Ciudad Juarez. We know about the number of women that have literally disappeared in Juarez because women tend to stand up for civil rights and liberties, and then they disappear. This book was written by the aunt of one of my students, a fine scholar in her own right. We can pass that one around. So every time a legitimate government agent, whether they're a police officer or a politician or an attorney, tries to corral, and there's just literally an action-reaction process, tries to corral the drug traders, the cartels, something happens to them. It's really problematic. Rule of law, not safe. Yeah. There's a lot more detail we could give to those. And of course, those cartels depend on the area that you're in. Like Colombia, they have spheres of influence, like the Medellin cartel, et cetera. But it's rough. It's not good. I would say that the Mexican political party system is getting better and the elections are getting better, but there's still a lot of alienation and just a lot of corruption. Yeah. My students gave a heck of a presentation. We just finished Mexico on exactly that issue and the violence, particularly against anybody who opposes them. One group that made a difference in a particular area, the Zapatistas. Emilio Zapata was one of the revolutionaries of that early revolution that I described. And Emilio Zapata, so they named themselves the Zapatistas. On the day NAFTA was signed, they said, wait a minute, we're going to get exploited. And they started the EZLN, or the Zapatista movement. And they created they occupied and created their own zone of fair wages, no drug cartels, local control, really direct democracy. Now they're running counter to the federal government, which is kind of illegal, but they're trying to create safe towns, safe places. This is a really good, let me pass this around too. This is a really good standard Latin American politics text. It's got chapters on everything. Highly recommend. I can give you all kinds of other reading on Central America. I hope that began to answer the question. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm surprised about the Zapatistas. My experience has been that I went to a place that was run by a couple of people from Switzerland, a kind of a ranch where people could come and relax, etc. Zapatistas came in, tore everything up.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing was left.
Why would they do that?
I don't know.
Because they don't have the land. Some rich dude from Switzerland came in and took their land. Now, I'm not justifying what the Zapatistas did, but that's the explanation they would give.
Sure.
They want to be, let's go back to that term sovereignty. They want to be economically sovereign, politically sovereign, and socially sovereign. So when someone comes in and buys land and says, hey, let's do whatever, that means they lost land and lost sovereignty. Does that make sense? I'm not justifying, you know, what the Zapatistas did by any means, but it kind of explains. Yeah. Oh, they've been notorious. Yeah, no doubt about it. There's one over here. And maybe we'll call this the last one. Yeah.
Nicaragua.
Oh, the question was, what happened to the canal in Nicaragua? Well, the first answer is the engineering was a lot more difficult than they thought. And I'm not an engineer, but that's what I understand from my reading of that. There was a lake, and they were going to go through that lake and then pipe through the other side. The second thing that happened was a guy by the name of Bunau and Bunau Varilla that negotiated the treaty were kind of scammers, and they wanted to take American investment money. So they took this money and then didn't really put it into building the canal. We're talking about, well, around the turn of the century, early 1900s. I have to think about exactly the date of when they tried to pop that canal through Nicaragua. But there are a number of factors. And just environmentally, it was very unsafe in terms of the water and the bugs and the malaria. So they had a hard time. Once word got back to the United States and other places I'm not working on that. You're gonna have to pay me a lot more money if you want me to go down there and work on that. Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you for your time and attention.
Thank you.
I would be willing, oh, they turned it off. I have looking in front of me the war in Ukraine and the situation on Hamas and Israel. I just spent 2 days at the Michigan Political Science Nerd Association conference. It's our state level conference over at University of Michigan Flint, where I chaired a panel on the war in Ukraine and then moderated a luncheon discussion on the war in Hamas and Palestine. So if anybody has any questions or comments, I'd be happy to stay for at least another couple minutes. Yeah, it's just awful. Yeah.